Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today's guests are joining us to talk about an aspect of prison that's rarely discussed. And yet if we were to ask anybody who's lived or worked in a prison, what's the most striking thing about prison, I suspect their answer would fall within the domain covered by their research. So we're meeting with Kate Herrity and Jason Warr. Jason's not a new guest. If you've not already heard him talking about forensic psychology on a podcast a few weeks ago, then you really should. He's Associate Professor in Criminology at the University of Nottingham with research interests in penology, the Sociology of Power, narrative and sensory criminology, and the philosophy of science. Kate's book, Sound, Order and Survival in Prison, was released on the 31st of January, and the book's based on her doctoral research exploring the significance of sound in a local men's prison. She curates sensorycriminology.com, a companion to Sensory Penalities, which she co-edited with Bethany Schmidt as well as Jason, and that's released in paperback on March the 14th. And she's also Mellon King's Research Fellow in Punishment at the University of Cambridge, and we will share links to as much of that as we can do in the podcast notes. So really pleased to have you both on today. Good to see you again, Jason, and welcome, Kate.
Yeah, thank you for having us back.
Indeed. So, hello, Kate. Very nice to meet you, and good to see you again, Jason.
Thank you.
So, why has it taken so long, do you think, for anyone to meticulously investigate the impact of prison on our senses?
Well, I think there's... This will sound familiar to anyone who's listened to me before, but I think there are a number of reasons for this. And I think partly because... I mean, if we look at lots of the writing around prisons going back in history, lots of people have detailed lots of sensory kind of elements of the environment. But typically what they've done is they've used those sensory elements as a means of either taking the reader inside or explaining or trying to kind of thickly describe the environment itself. But they've used it as a descriptor, not as as either a lens through which to explore the prison or as a mechanism or try to understand what the senses are doing in and of itself. And I think part of the reasons for that, I think there are two kind of core reasons. I think one is that often when you look at sort of in-depth prisons studies and research, a lot of that is focused on the social life or the cultural life that exists either in the prison or for staff. How does staff cultural practice impact on them or on the prison? How does the cultural life of prisoners impact on their ability to survive the prison? And actually what we've had is this kind of, quite expansive, but also quite a narrow lens on certain elements of the prison system. But also I think there is a degree to which once you're in a prison and once you're kind of acculturated to the kind of environment of a prison, some of the environmental factors that you are experiencing kind of bleed into the background. They're just part of the kind of the stage, as it were, as you're kind of acting and interacting in the page. They become kind of background kind of elements to your experience. And I think what it's taken really is a kind of number of outsiders, and specifically Kate, but an outsider coming along and going, actually, why does that sound like that? Why does that smell like that? What is that doing? What's that doing? And it's only when you get that kind of informed, sensitive, outside perspective has it allowed people like us who are kind of really acculturated into the environment to start thinking about, oh, yeah, actually, no, that is an important thing. Why do we think that? Why does that happen? What impact is that having on us? And actually, if we think about the senses, what they're doing is communicating information to us. And I think actually that kind of, if we think about this in terms of classic sociology, that kind of symbolic interactionism, how do we interpret the sounds or the symbols that our material environment is communicating to us in very specific ways has lost ground really in criminology, even though criminology is a somewhat bastard subject and we steal bits of ideas from all over. But those kind of core sociological
rendezvous, darling, rendezvous.
Yeah. Magpie discipline, but it's but one of those, and I genuinely think that kind of that core sociological imagination has kind of lessened with a more kind of focus on social life, cultural, or even political economic kind of ideas as they relate to the prison. And I genuinely think that it kind of took someone else coming in and going, what's happening there, to actually sort of kickstart that kind of more narrowed focus on what these elements of the environment are doing, but also these elements of the kind of penality, how ideas of punishment are communicated more succinctly, and actually start to kind of really narrow in and think about what is happening. When you hear the clangs of a door, when you hear when you have when you can't escape the kind of that industrial cleaning products that they use in all kind of prison institutions. What is it when you can't escape that smell? Those inherent to that smell in that environment is a communication of something. And actually what we need to do in terms of sensory kind of criminology and sensory penalities is start to think about those things more deliberately, if that makes sense.
Thank you. So sounds like an interesting constellation of ideas and experiences. And I think you're quite right that when you spend a lot of time inside a prison, it does become normalized. It's what you expect every day, and you don't notice just what sort of impact it might be having on you.
So Kate, I just said, so I was wondering, Kate, if there was, a lot of people go into prisons and for the first time they're already struck by the sensory experiences, but they perhaps don't feel confident enough to ask the questions that might be evoked in them. And I wondered if there was something about you that you managed to retain your curiosity and actually have the confidence to ask the questions that other people might be a little bit shy of asking.
Yeah, for several reasons. I think probably the same reason that sound struck me as so significant in the first place. Because I'm ND myself, so I'm interested particularly in how the sensory experience of prison impacts on people who have neurodivergence of some description. I think that made it strike me as more significant because the very first time I visited prison, I was still working as a library assistant. I hadn't yet gone back to school. I visited in my capacity as a library assistant to go and see the library, funnily, at HMP Wandsworth. And I talk about this in the book, that I stood in the central control point, which is, of course, quite famous, particularly in Wandsworth. And I was just completely overwhelmed by this swirling cacophony around me. I could see all the spurs or landings. I could see people coming off the first night centre onto the main wing. I could see the substance use treatment section. I could see all this life going on around me, but I couldn't make head nor tail of this overwhelming barrage of sound. And its particular relationship with the surfaces, of course, and the way it was reverberating, the way there was nothing to absorb it other than human bodies, really, which is what characterises most prison spaces, certainly in England and Wales. And it just struck me that that must have some significance for the way people experience that environment. And I guess my starting point was my own experience, but also then my frustration with how little account there was for that in academic work. So if you read prisoner autobiographies, you often come across the experience of sound and soundscape and the sensory more broadly, the way it smells, the way it feels, the discomfort. But we don't really talk about it in academia, conventionally at least. And I think part of that is also because culturally, more broadly, we privilege what we see. And scientific language or academic language is bound up with this idea that the scientific ideal is about what we can observe, what we can replicate, and the appearance of things. But that actually has very limited reflection or relation to how we actually make sense of our world as human beings. But it takes, I guess, a certain stubbornness and probably also a certain guilelessness to persist with a question that you have. I mean, people were very resistant to the idea that I should do this, firstly for my master's, which I used to pilot my research method, but also then for my PhD, which I was campaigning to be able to do at the same time and alongside. And I still remember Ian Loader, who I have great respect for, and he's one of the best teachers I've ever encountered. He was head of criminology at the time that I was interviewed for my master's, which I did do at Oxford. And I still remember his words saying to me, "Isn't this just another pains of imprisonment? Haven't we done that? What is this adding?" And I think much of my time subsequently has been spent interrogating why and how it isn't just another pains of imprisonment, and how we account for those distinctions. But yeah, a little bit of stubbornness too.
I had quite a strong reaction to that when you were talking, because and even you saw when I posted something yesterday about smell on Twitter, and somebody had responded to say sound is so significant in terms of triggering symptoms of PTSD, that actually hearing sounds, and we know that people in prison largely have histories of trauma. So I think there's that reaction, but also I went to work in prison after working in a psychiatric hospital, a locked ward, where the patients would complain whenever the nursing office door got just let go, so it would slam. And so actually staff became really good at making sure they let the door close gently and quietly behind them, because ultimately this was people's home potentially for five years. And then so it was really shocking to go into a prison and doors be left slamming all the time, which did make you wonder about what that communicated about respect for people, that in some ways that the staff were prepared to be conditioned to shut the door more quietly in a psychiatric hospital, but actually to ask that of prison officers seemed a step too far. That was going to be a big challenge to get that to happen.
I mean, one of the things, just picking up on that, one of the things that's quite interesting, and actually Ben Gunn writes about this in a blog post written many years ago, is that often you can tell the mood of the officers by how loud they are in terms of unlocking doors. So actually, first thing in the morning, what you don't want is clank, clank, clank as they unlock the doors, because all of a sudden it puts people on edge. So actually, when you've got, if you hear that, then you know that the officers are in a bad mood that day, or one officer is in a bad mood that day, and that can then impact on how that day within the prison operates and runs.
It's interesting. One of you mentioned smell. I was in a prison very recently, and they have a group room. They have 3 group rooms. They have one group room downstairs from where they mainly live, and a group room is somewhere they meet. They sit in a circle. They talk a bit and they think, and they're very familiar with that safe place. But the prison insists that it's also used for general association, which means any of the nearby prisoners from different wings and groups can go into it and sort of do what they like. And every morning when the group goes in there, there's a different smell, and it's always an unpleasant smell, and so they have to tidy up, somehow get rid of the smell. Anyway, stubbornness and guilelessness. Have you got similar questions, Jason?
Well, I think for me, I'm kind of also endlessly curious, but I think one of the interesting things was that, obviously, having lived in prisons and then becoming a prisons researcher and discussing and kind of exploring prisons, even to me, even though, lots of my history is kind of absolutely shaped by the kind of sensory experience of the prison, I'd not really explored or thought through many of those things. And it was only really when, talking to Kate and after her trip to Wandsworth and her talking about just like, how can anyone cope with that swirling cacophony of noise? And actually, what does it mean? What does this bit mean? What does that bit mean? And it was only really like hearing Kate talk and think these things through that then kind of made me go, oh yeah, but what about? Oh yeah, what about? And then I started to think about. So really, my interests in terms of the sensory really emerges from Kate's work, and I think, if we look at the Sensory Penalities book, we acknowledge in the introduction to that actually, both Bethany, mine, and the other contributors to that book, our interest and our kind of curiosity about these issues really emerged from Kate's work and Kate's experiences, I think.
Thinking that the opposite of cacophony is absolute silence, which in a prison can be rather threatening, because it usually just means one thing: everybody's locked up. And Grendon, after 3 prisoners escaped in, I think, 2003, was the quietest place I'd ever been for a couple of weeks. Extraordinary. Anyway, how does this feel deep and Sorry?
Sorry, I've lost you again. One moment. I think if I take my camera away, I can hear you sporadically. Just every now and then I get a lag. So you're back, but I just missed what you just said, David. Sorry.
Oh, well, you missed it all.
He was saying about how silence in the prison is
can be a bit forbidding, because it means everybody's locked up. And I described how silent Grendon prison was for about 2 weeks after 3 prisoners escaped.
Yes, I mean, certainly it features strongly in men's accounts that I've spoken to of violence and its precursors and how you read the environment. So this is also an aspect of jailcraft which is underexplored and under-recognised, but which can be crucial to safety and well-being, because you can read the emotional climate of a space, and actually you come to understand, and the process of coming to understand is something that I have tried to explicate and build upon to explain, because it's partially one of acculturation. You suddenly realize that you too can hear when trouble is coming, and typically before it comes there is a silence, there is a drop. When things are, and there's a distinction between an isolated incident and an anticipation of an isolated incident, and a prison in which trouble is brewing in that broader sense of discontent, or what prison language might refer to as concerted indiscipline or broader disturbance, which will often manifest in a series of what sounds like false alarms, because the sound will drop out and everyone will think, people will stop what they're doing. And there's a point in the book where I talk about having reached a point with this prison where I'd spent a long time and I got to know it very well, and I'd been accepted in to do my research at a point where the prison was in a really stable place. It had improved hugely in its key markers, it had won awards, so on and so forth, and yet in over 6 months things had started to deteriorate for a multitude of external reasons over which the prison itself had no control, or little control, as is always the case, of course, because things are so dictated by HQ. But things like, Mamba use, and that had coincided with the tobacco ban, and my field notes become peppered with staff saying to me, "Oh, I thought it had kicked off then. Oh, I thought it had kicked off then," because this jerky, or what is referred to by prison staff as a bubbly environment or a spiky environment, which is when things are unsafe, people are on edge, they're anticipating incidents, there is a greater number of incidents of a variety of forms and seriousness, from individuals' distress to and self-harm to harming others and so forth. But that silence is an absolutely crucial indicator, and it has a texture to it. There's a difference between a calmness that you might find in the middle of the night, but also actually, because I spent the night inside, I was permitted to do that, which was very, very generous of my hosts, and something, I couldn't manage to do that while I was volunteering for the IMB, where you're necessary to check in and see what's going on, particularly in care and segregation, as it's referred to. But spending the night and listening to the way sounds drop until the isolation of some or the sleeplessness of others becomes amplified in the spaces in between. Silence is every bit as important as its antonym, but of course it isn't directly, because of course quiet so often doesn't mean quiet. And when you're asked, and I reached a point quite quickly where the staff would commonly, if they were coming on the wing after me, would ask me, "Oh, how does it sound today?" or "How does it feel today?" I learnt that what you never do is, "Oh, quiet," because it's akin to evoking the Scottish play. You don't do that. It means trouble is coming.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that's quite interesting, is that if you take a prison in a normal day, if all of a sudden it drops quiet, if it drops silent, then that silence is actually incredibly loud.
Yeah.
if you think of it that way, because all of a sudden the communication of that silence is shouting, kind of danger, beware. All of a sudden that communicative element is just like, be alert, something is coming. And I think that's, and as Kate said, this is a key element of jailcraft, not just for staff, but for prisoners as well. And I think that's the type of thing that people who are acculturated take for granted. And that's why it took someone coming in and going, well, what does that mean?
But it's so important in terms of risk assessment, isn't it? You could walk onto a wing and you could literally tell what
Yes.
the atmosphere is like. And I think that's the danger of, when people are rotated, which obviously it goes up when you've got a lot of unfamiliar staff around, then you have that sense of being ill at ease and on edge. But also when you've got managers that don't understand the climate of somewhere, potentially miss really important information. And, obviously not in terms of prisons, but hospitals, when you've got the likes of, incidents at obviously Nottingham Trust was recently in the news, and Edenfield Centre, but actually experienced managers are able to tell when something is amiss. They're able to see the impact of decisions which might feel like they're the only decisions you can make, but you can tell that things are becoming unsafe in quite a chronic way for a service.
I think in the prison service, detached duties, although necessary to maintain the kind of emergency regimes that are often running if you've got people in on detached duties, simultaneously necessary, but incredibly problematic. I mean, Kate in her book's got a line about the everyday tune, right? Do you want to pick that up, Kate?
Well, but I'm also keen not to move too far away from the topic. But I mean, I spoke to one senior officer who had spent most of his career in prisons, and he referred to the extent to which staff come to understand the everyday tune that's normal for here. And that refers to not only the particular institution they occupy, but the particular spaces within it. And he says not everyone learns this at the same time, not everyone is aware that they do, but he uses the example of, if you're a gym officer, which is not what they're called, but I forget what they're called, you can tell the difference between a thrown weight and a dropped one. And that's absolutely fundamental. But what the absence of that knowledge means for the prison environment can potentially be every bit as disruptive as it can prove to, say, a local prison when, for whatever reason, whether there's trouble somewhere or whether they're at the moment the courts are so backed up, the local prisons are being inundated with prisoners who are not from the area, which brings its own problems to the ecology and the community. But having prison staff moved about in that way can have similarly deleterious effects. The prisoners are aware of it, but the staff are certainly aware of it. And when I refer to it as Midtown, which is where I did my PhD, and I spent the best part of a year in and out of there, and I came to know it very well. And there was a prison not far away that was closing down, and loads of their staff were decanted into Midtown. Midtown were quite excited about the arrival of these staff. They're fairly local. They actually would have some familiarity with some of the individuals coming in and going out of the prison on the other side. But they spoke of being really frustrated with what they saw as a lack of camaraderie from the staff. They hadn't immediately managed to integrate into the community. And the staff themselves spoke of, from this other prison, spoke repeatedly to me about finding the environment incredibly difficult because there was no order here. There's no order. And of course, it wasn't that there was no order or no regime or no routine. It was that it was not familiar to them. And they equated that with an absence, which really spoke to their lack of familiarity and understanding with the distinctions between the spaces, which in turn, of course, emphasizes quite how important that is for effectively managing and working in a concerted effort to keep everything ticking over. And of course, it is a concerted effort, and it is a communal one, and it relies to a far greater extent on prisoners as well as staff than is usually acknowledged, I also argue. But yeah, that shunting people around, and necessary as it is, you're failing to appreciate the extent to which these are all social worlds, and they have particular rhythms and their own soundscapes, their own tunes.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate. So I just wonder if we could just shift off sound to a different sense, perhaps.
Absolutely.
And given that we could have easily had a whole podcast, I'm sure, on every sense. But some of the older Victorian prisons are very poorly ventilated. And what's it like living in such close proximity to others day after day and having to literally have other people's scent in your face?
I mean, it's one of those that, I mean, if we take certainly like a lot of the old Victorian prisons, and of course smells kind of seep into the very materials of the building, so they don't actually sometimes don't dissipate. in the same way that a sound does. It can dissipate and, I mean, it reverberates around for a long time, but it can dissipate. But actually smell can absolutely penetrate into and remain within the environment. And of course, prisons are places where people eat, breathe, live, to be crude, defecate, etc., etc., etc. And actually what you've got is just the smells of humanity trapped within the environment, which certainly at certain times of year get cooked. If you take a Victorian prison, certainly when they've put the cages over the windows so that the windows don't open fully, so that prisoners can't swing lines between windows. If you take that, and what it does is it reduces the airflow within the environment, so that it absolutely traps those smells in the cells, on the wings, within the prison. And then you ramp the temperature up to such an extent that people are not only being suffocated by these kind of this soup of human smells that becomes kind of quite noxious, but also then because they're sweating and they can't trap and they can't get out, they can't shower, they can't because certainly in during COVID, for instance, if we look at some of the reports and some of the writings around prisons during COVID, where people were locked up in their cells for pretty much 24 hours a day, and during an incredibly hot summer, what you've got is in every single prison, you've got people just stewing in their own filth. Because they cannot get out to have a shower, they cannot get out to clean themselves, and what that does is it creates this really, as I say, a noxious soup of really pungent and acrid smells that exist in the environment and don't go away. But what's actually interesting is it's not just the impact of those smells on individuals, it's not just the impact of that lack of movement of air, it's what that lack of movement of air is saying about the institution itself, the practices of the institution, and the way that the individual prisoners are perceived within the practices of the institution. So if we think for a minute, if we take human rights legislation and the concept of dignity, humans have value dignity because that's what they are. But in order to have a dignified life, what you need is conditioned dignity, so dignity within the conditions that you're existing in. But if we force people to live in circumstances where they are absolutely trapped within this kind of noxious sensory environment, then actually what that says is that we're not keeping those people in a dignified life. We don't have conditioned dignity there. And if we're not allowing people to have conditioned dignity, then actually we're not really perceiving them in a way of having value dignity in and of themselves. So the fact that we trap people in these environments during summer or during any other period where they absolutely cannot escape this kind of noxious element of the environment, then actually that says something quite bad about the way that we see the value of the people who we are subjecting that to. And that's one of the kind of core areas of sensory penalities. It's not just looking at the physical impact of these things on people, because of course there's health impacts as well, but actually what that means in terms of our ideas of punishment, penalty, human rights, etc., etc.
I was struck when you were talking about, what that's like when that's the situation for the prisoners and they're interacting with staff and visitors who obviously there's an imbalance there, isn't there, in terms of lack of access to be able to maintain your hygiene. With that real imbalance, what is that like?
In terms of what it feels like in some senses, obviously I'm limited in what I can convey because I haven't been subject to that myself, but it's certainly the case that the men that I spend a lot of time with, sometimes spoke to every day, would be preoccupied with efforts to maintain levels of hygiene and it to such an extent that it becomes performative, because it's a performance of dignity and of conserving and retaining and rebuilding that membrane between yourself and the institution, and its attempts to pervade that and intrude upon that. On the individual level, that obviously, well, maybe not obviously to other people, but when you shared that piece yesterday about smell and trauma, there was one particular person that I spent a lot of time with who would speak about how when he would get out, because he'd been in and out of Midtown, various other prisons for around 38 years, upon release, he would wash and wash and wash and get rid of his clothes and do everything he could to get rid of that prison smell. But of course, that prison smell that he felt was on his skin had intruded through his pores. And this process of washing and washing was not unrelated to various traumas that he recounted to me that he'd experienced as a child, being cared for by the state, where he had been abused profoundly and systematically. And when he was having an episode, he would lock himself in the shower, whereas he had done when he was a child, because it was the place where he felt safe. But this was also related to smell in other ways. So there was an occasion that he relayed to me where it was during unlock, and the prison officer who was unlocking him smelt of a particular aftershave that triggered memories of his abuse as a child. And he said to the officer, well, he told me, I didn't see the conversation, but he told me that he'd said to the officer, you will have to stop wearing that, or I will not be responsible for what happens. And the officer said, what are you talking about? This is just aftershave. And he said, it's the same aftershave that my rapist used to wear when I was a child. And he said, fair play to him, the officer never wore it again. But the willingness to do that actually reflected on a particular understanding of this individual and his history that was reflective of a particular set of relationships, understandings and sensitivities of this community local prison that sort of relates to what we were talking about earlier, in the sense of the necessity of establishing those relationships and that understanding in order to be sympathetic and understanding and a little trauma informed, albeit in a really kind of unofficial, anecdotal, shared, supportive way that reflected the particular relationships between these people. But the extent to which, I know Jay mentioned wanting to talk about the anecdote of the dog. Right, so I was doing some work with Leicester Prison. They set up the first arts festival in prison, and I was working with them to chart how the men were finding it, and wrote a piece on it, which you can find in Prison Service Journal. I think it's 239, might be a bit off there, but I think it's 239. And on one occasion, I was taking some students in. I'd been invited to take some students in to see a particular music performance for the men in the chapel. And one of these students, who's no longer with us, was blind. And so she had Zena, her guide dog. And we were going through the visitors' space. And we reached the corridor, the point where all the visitors go through. And Zena became completely uncooperative. She wouldn't move. She was exhibiting signs of being traumatized, being distressed. I mean, dogs hear differently, so it may be that she could also hear the men, but I mean, certainly we couldn't, and we weren't in that part of the prison. And the staff who were seeing us through and patting us down as we went through the corridor were remarking on the way the dog must be smelling the upset and distress of all the people who'd gone through that space, because of course at visits you always have crying children on the way in and out, particularly on the way out because they're leaving their dads behind, or it's not a particularly pleasant space, although they made efforts in Leicester, and I'm not knocking them specifically. But it was really interesting the way that the dog was providing a proxy that allowed the staff to talk about the emotionally heightened nature of that particular space in ways that I really don't think they would have either acknowledged or felt comfortable acknowledging if it wasn't for the dog.
Yeah.
Which was... No, carry on.
Well, I was going to say, and I think specifically was because the staff, this is a guide dog. This is a trained dog who was on the lead, so it was working. It was a working dog, and it just tail between its leg, its bum's down, its ear was flat, and it was trembling. You know what I mean? And it was such a visceral response from the dog to the space, because it'd been fine before we walked through the airlock. But the minute we got past the other side of that, bang, it happened. And I think it was that was just such a response. So here's this this poor girl who's blind, who's reliant on her dog to navigate the space, who all of a sudden is having to care for her dog in order to get through the space. And I think that hit the staff in a way that was not, that was really about the kind of sensory of that particular, or the sensory kind of context of that space, but as Kate said, in a way that they would never have done to people.
No, and also related to that was the acknowledgement that, albeit implicit, it's not like we stopped for a massive philosophical conversation about the way in which the senses allow us to traverse time. Don't get me wrong, like aside from anything else, we were going through security and we were just trying to get the dog to do what the dog we were accustomed to doing. I'd never seen Xena behave like that ever, not before or since, and I spent a lot of time with Ashley, actually, who is no longer with us. So but there was an implicit understanding that human emotion in some sense has some physical aspects to it or material aspects to it in the form of sensory traces that remain, that shape that space and the way it's experienced. That was an entire conversation that simply would not have happened in the absence of Xena. And it relates, of course, in that sense to broader understandings of the smell of fear, the memory of fear. One prison officer who, governor, in fact, sorry, number one, he was number one of Aylesbury for some time, I don't know, Kevin Leggett, used to do lectures for students. And he told me that whenever he was trying to explain to students, it would usually be undergrads, whenever he was trying to explain the particularities of the environment, he would take with him a bag of prison laundry and upend it and invite them to smell it, because there is something really distinct about the smell of prison laundry. And I can't put my finger on exactly what it is, but I know that's smell. I know that smell, and I immediately, when I speak of it, it evokes my memory of it. I can't tell you, I couldn't describe it for you verbally, but I mean, there is a specific smell to prison laundry, right? That's not just me.
No. And I've got now like a pale blue kind of image in my head.
Yeah.
There's nothing to do with the smell, but it's that blue t-shirts, that kind of pale blue t-shirt.
Two very powerful images there, first with the dog and then with the laundry. And actually, thank you for mentioning Kevin Leggett, because we've interviewed him previously and he's a really lovely, thoughtful guest that we've had on. But could we talk a little bit about touch? So we know that affectionate touch is implicated in well-being, but unwanted touch is obviously extremely aversive. How do prisoners cope with the lack of kind touch and conversely the intrusion of unwanted touch, especially when they have histories of trauma?
in some ways I would be tempted to defer to Jay, which I will do shortly. But there are a multitude, I think, of elements to touch that are in some ways the ways in which power becomes most tangible and most easily recognizable and most viscerally experienced, not only in the more obvious senses of the incarcerated, confined body, so you literally can't go where you want, you can't see where you want. If you're imprisoned, you can see it in the very limited parameters of your hatch if it's open, and that's controlled from the outside. Which is partly why other sensory, which is part of what got me interested in sound in the first place. But I mean, sound was always about the interaction of different senses, not sound in and of itself. So there's that sense in which the imposition of particular touch is experienced. And of course, that's profoundly difficult for a number of people who identify as neurodivergent. Whether or not they have particular post-traumatic stress of some description, in addition to these other issues and conditions, but being touched is not experienced the same by people who are ND. I don't experience it or process those experiences in the same way that other people do. People on the autistic spectrum find it very, very difficult. And so you have the particular imposition of touch is experienced not only as a profound assault on dignity, autonomy, agency, but also can trigger all manner of traumatic responses or aggressive responses, depending on who you're speaking to, which have massive implications for outcome, but particularly for people who are neurodiverse. And I think this will become clearer as people are doing more work on it. I know a little bit of interesting stuff that's going on, but also the absence of caring touch, gentle touch, affectionate touch, the absence of intimacy or intimacy of your choosing with those you love and care for, the lack of ability, and particularly during COVID. And I don't think we've gone anywhere near far enough to unpacking what the impact of not being able to hold your children for the best part of 2 years will have had for people who were in prison during that time. But also the ways in which those aspects of human experience relate to what Cooley referred to as the looking glass self. And he's quoted in Sykes's Society of Captives. Sorry, very nearly. Where Cooley talks about the extent to which being seen through the eyes of a loved one reaffirms your sense of yourself in that sense, those aspects of who you are, by someone who cares for you. But that extends also to the way you're touched and handled. And I know Jay has a huge amount to say about the imposition of unwanted touch in the form of body searches, but before I just let him talk about that, because he has a very interesting chapter on it and also a blog post on the Sensory Criminology blog post, there's a particular anecdote that I've referred to on a number of occasions and is in the book as well, but really encapsulates something that is quite profoundly felt by prisoners, but also something that you navigate often without explicitly referring to it. So when you asked me earlier about, is there something about the way you ask questions that other people don't? There's also a way that I have a tendency to verbalize questions that I have or reflections in a way. It's not that I'm completely unfiltered. I am a little bit, but it's not that I'm completely unfiltered, it's that I have a greater tendency to just go, well, hang on, what's that about? So I was having a chat with Lugs one day on the wing, and he was again someone I spent a lot of time talking to, about smell, actually, quite a bit, because he was a laundry orderly, and he'd spray fabric softener around the entrance to his cell so it smelled differently. And then he'd comment when I came on, "Do you like it, miss? It smells different today." So one day I come on and I'm talking to Lugs, and he goes, "Oh, I've got a really itchy back. Do me a favour, give me a scratch." And I said, I can't. And he said, "What do you mean you can't?" And I said, "Well, I can't touch you. The way it will be perceived if I touch you in this environment will jeopardize both of us. Like it will seriously place question marks over my head and the way and whether or not I'm having appropriate relationships, but also it won't be great for you. So I can't do that." And he was like, "Are you sure?" And I'm like, "Yeah, have you never noticed that there's this whole range of unspoken behaviours that are governed by particular gendered impositions of risk and so on and so forth?" I didn't put it in quite those terms, because when I did, they just make fun of me. But, you know, so he's trying to scratch his back up and down the wall, and then a nurse walks by, and he's not satisfied with my response to his questions. So he wants to engage other people. So the nurse is walking by and he goes, "Miss, can I stop you?" "Yeah, of course you can." "Is it true that you can't touch people in here?" And she said, "Yeah, it is. And it's really difficult because as a nurse, you're taught that touch is part of the process of healing, of caring, of nurturing, of reassuring people. But in here, we can't do that. And it feels very strange." And he was like, "Oh." And then a prison officer walked by and he goes, Sir, is it true that we can't touch each other? I've got a really itchy back and she can't touch me." And I was like, "Well, with this, how I'm not going to touch you anyway, but okay." And he said, "Yeah, it is true. You can't touch her, but I can." And he ran his hand slowly down my arm in the creepiest way ever. And it was such a bizarre demonstration of power, his greater power, that apparently exceeded my ability to have a say over who and how I was touched, in order to display to this other person who was exploring a curiosity that he did not have it. And that was quite, and you know, I didn't scratch his back, obviously, but I would ordinarily do that. I've done it to a really struggling stranger, but I mean, I also have a bit of a bus stop face. But Jay has things to say about, you know what I mean. Like, I'm one of those people. Like, if I stop, someone will tell me their life story. Some of us do. But Jay has a lot more to say about power, so sorry, Jay.
No, it's cool. But yeah, I think one of the things with power is that, also with touch, is that, you know, if we go back to that idea that, you know, within the sensory, there is a communication of something, you know, and nowhere is that more evident than in touch in prisons. That actually the power, not just of the prison officer, not just of the institution, but of the state, is actually encoded into a lot of the touches that prisoners are subject to, and visitors and anyone else and staff who happen to be searched as all. You know, every time the prison lays its hands on someone, there is the communication of that power, and simultaneously a reinforcing of your status as someone without power. You know, and that is continually going on. You know, if you think about just the sheer amount of times that people will have a pat-down search in a prison, you know, often every time you go through a portal, you know, as a prisoner, every time they go through a portal, you can be subject to a pat-down search. And every single time. So constantly what's happening is that the prison is reinforcing its power over you through that touch. And of course, any, you know, if, as Kate said, you know, if someone has any of the kind of ND conditions, or if anyone has trauma or even mental health problems, you know, they may have both a touch sensitivity and touch defensiveness in terms of their response to that. And of course, if you react in a way that rejects the touch of the prison, all that does is invite more touch, and more powerful and more painful touch. I mean, just this week we've seen, the case of a young child, a girl in a young offenders institute or a secure training centre, or the juvenile element of a young offender institute, who, because of her self-harm, was subject to a full, to strip search by men on repeated occasions. And if you think about just, what you've got is a child who is in an incredibly vulnerable state with God knows what histories, who is then being subject to this power of powerful men being imposed upon her over and over and over and over again. Whether or not there's a care principle inherent to that is almost irrelevant. The fact that it is that power being communicated is incredibly, I don't think we fully understand what that means. And I think it's only, partly that's why I wrote that chapter on, the imposition of touch and the manner in which that can be utilized by others. I think we spoke about this when I did the interview around the forensic psychologists. One of the forensic psychologists realized that a quite toxic male member of staff was using other female members of staff to essentially assault her. So, it was a kind of touch by proxy. But again, in and of that self, these are normal, routine activities within the prison, but which can have hugely profound communicative effects of a lot of different things, and actually can compound the traumas that individuals have very significantly. I mean, the number of people I've spoken to who have had histories of trauma, or even histories of institutional trauma, that all of a sudden, like a pat down search, which everyone, because people will say, if you've got nothing to hide, then it doesn't matter. But no, it's an intrusion upon your body by someone who has power over you. And that in and of itself, the communication of that in and of itself, tells you that you do not have, that you are in a lower problematic status, which, can have profound effects on individuals.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up something that Kate was saying earlier when you were describing this, what I suppose could be described as an assault by the member of staff as he stroked your arm, because I assume that raised a kind of issue about your position as a researcher in that situation, and the anxiety of losing access to the gateway if you actually laid a complaint. How did you feel about that?
Honestly, as what I imagine is a fairly average woman who grew up in London, I couldn't tell you how many times people have put their hands on me in places that I didn't invite them. It didn't really register in that way so much as it effectively communicated a conversation that Lugs and I were only partially articulating explicitly, because there's an extent to which, as a researcher, as a visitor in those spaces, and particularly as a woman, I think you recognize that there's a certain riskiness that just attaches to female bodies, or bodies that identify as female, and you carry that risk with you, and it's evaluated in every assessment and observation of pretty much every exchange you have with every prisoner while you're there. So I really felt at the time that it was a beautiful illustration of everything I was trying to communicate to Lugs, but was being quite careful about the way I said it, because you're always being overheard and you're always, but you know, and to an extent, I mean, that's inevitable. Security is the prism through which everything is assessed and interpreted in prison spaces. That's just the way that is, really. Everything is subsumed under the primary importance of security, absolutely everything, including individual survival. That's demonstrably the case. So you're sort of balancing various rules, etiquettes and interpretations of your behavior and your interactions that you cannot see. And that is a far bigger fear to me while I was in prison than anyone actually touching me in ways that I did. Like I felt fairly safe, certainly where the men were concerned. I mean, I have women researcher friends who have been actually physically assaulted by officers because they've been in spaces where the officers decided they didn't want them, and prisoners have come to their aid. Which is not to paint prison officers as one amorphous group of people. I'm very keen not to do that. Not only would it be inaccurate, but it would be profoundly unfair to do that, I think. Well, it just would. But those actual risks were far less important to me and had far less primacy than the perception of risk that might attach to me. So there were moments when things happened, you know, as happens when you're in a men's prison. Sometimes people say inappropriate things. They haven't been around women a lot. They're bored. I was in the middle of an interview one day, and we were in a different space than I conducted most of my interviews. But whenever I was interviewing the men, I was always somewhere within the wing, like either in a space for legal visits or a classroom, or, you know, wherever there was space, very limited space. And on this occasion, we were in the induction room, which was right by the First Night Centre, which happened to be where people were walking past for gym. And overexcitedly, while I was in the middle of this interview, one gentleman decided to shout through the hatch that he intended to ejaculate on my face. Now, that's not pleasant or appropriate. It's sexually violent. It was also not feasible. I mean, he was moving. I was behind a door. I didn't feel threatened by that, to be honest. More ridiculous things have been said to me in my time. I spent years working in the bar trade. What did invite profound anxiety, though, was who had overheard that and what they might make of my position and the risk I posed as a result. And that terrified me. And I didn't quite know how to manage that. It's the kind of thing that happens that we don't talk about explicitly because we don't want to draw attention to perceptions of our riskiness. And we think if we speak about that overtly, that's going to bring more problems on our head. But actually, in a prison environment, the more you relinquish privacy and shame, the more overt you are about trouble and problem that you encounter. Conversely, kind of the less risky you're perceived to be. So I went around telling everyone that someone had been incredibly rude to me. I didn't know who it was. I lectured several of the men about sexual aggressiveness and disrespect. And of course, they were all upset about that because, well, I didn't say anything. I wasn't there. And I was like, that's not the point. I spoke to various members of staff about it to let them know. You know, not in a way of I am worried about this, but this thing happened and I am speaking about how this thing happened. And part of that was because of other instances I know of where women who have been working in that space in sort of voluntary or auxiliary capacities and had similar things happen to them, in the sense of certainly stories have been said about inappropriate behaviour that nobody everyone knew wasn't happening, and yet they were asked not to return because they've been compromised by these stories and these behaviours. So that's a very long way of saying, I guess the last thing that occurred to me was that he shouldn't be I mean, it was creepy, I didn't like it. Who does? But I mean, you know, it actually served such a beautiful demonstration of this entire subtext between this conversation Lugs and I were having about these spaces and the absence of friendly human touch, and how it becomes loaded with so many layers of meaning that you cannot begin to excavate them. You can only navigate and avoid them.
Thank you. That's a very clear answer.
Just to pick up, I just want to pick up on your question, David, though, about being a researcher in prison and the sensory environment. I think it's important that one of the things that we acknowledge is that as a researcher in a prison, you too cannot escape the sensory environment in which you're in. And actually, as a visitor to that space, you actually hold a positionality in relation to, if you think about as a researcher, you have a class positionality, you have an ethnicity positionality, you have an educational positionality, you have an intent positionality, etc., etc., etc. But you also have a sensory one. And I think we need to kind of account for that in the manner in which we then interpret the environment that we're then studying. And I'll give you an example for this. Many years ago, when it was the first time I'd ever gone back to a prison as a research kind of role. And there was a group of us going into a prison that I had previously been in many years before. And immediately they slammed the gate behind me. They always have a habit of slamming gates. So they slammed the gate behind me. And one of my fellow visitors happened to be looking at me at the point that the gate slammed. And they said it was really interesting because they said the Jason that I know went away. And all of a sudden I could see Jason the prisoner. And she said that really shook her, because all of a sudden, just within the clang of that gate, I had shifted from who she knew into someone else. And actually, I felt at the time that the clang of the gate had moved me from my position as a researcher who's curious, who's coming in to do a piece of research, into something and someone else, and something and someone else I had been. And I think that was, part of my own positionality as someone who's doing research in these environments. I've had to account for the manner in which the environment impacts on me, as both a former prisoner and a researcher, that I think a lot of people would not ordinarily kind of consider. And it's only really kind of considering the sensory has allowed me to kind of unpick some of that.
Or conversely, how you can sensorially affect the environment, which is a reflection, I think, not only of our experience and our relative positionalities, but also our gender, in the sense that we have to account for the way we inhabit spaces quite differently. So the presentation of self is fundamental in a way that it just isn't. Like, there are certain things you might decide. I know Jason often makes a point of putting his rings on and so forth when he's going into prison, but for me it will be things like wearing trainers. I usually wear a pair of 110s, which is a slang for like a particular kind of Nike trainer. And I wear them deliberately because the men will recognize the cultural capital attached to trainers, which is quite a complex thing. But no one else other than men on enhanced would be wearing them. So it immediately indicates that, unlike any other white middle-aged woman who you might find in prison who's not in black and whites, I'm not resettlement, I'm not psychology, I'm not education, I'm other. But also the decision to wear perfume, because I always wear perfume. But it's almost a kind of act of protest in the prison space, because women don't. I mean, you can smell products, but perfume is something different. I think it's changing a little bit now. So we're going back a few years to when I was in and out constantly, although I'm trying to get back in to extend my work, but that's another story. But you know, the men would sometimes smell me, which is an incredibly intimate, weird thing that can, of course, be drastically misinterpreted. It wasn't sexual, and it wasn't. What I was carrying was the smell of outside, of other times, of other spaces, of partners or girlfriends, or walking down the street. I was talking to someone who works in prison just the other week, who was saying literally sometimes when you enter prison spaces from, you know, the air, you carry the smell of the outside with you. But the way you account for those things, and have to account for those things, or my voice, I laugh a lot. I'm a very laughy person, but in a man's prison, you know, that really echoes around. I mean, it can alter the mood, and not in a bad way, not in a negative way, but in a way that prompts you to think about how you're interacting with the environment and the people within it, how you navigate and balance those lines carefully, what that means for how you understand. So, you know, it was quite early on where people started responding to me in a manner of sort of mutual inquiry, not dissimilar to that conversation I had with Lugs. It wasn't isolated. Those were conversations I would frequently have, you know. So what does the bell do? What does trouble sound like? But also made me keenly aware of the way that I could, and sometimes was perceived to, spread calm in the positive sense. So one or two men would tell me that they liked to stand in my vicinity because it was calm. Partly, of course, because I wasn't moving, because I wanted to make sure that all the officers could see where I was. Because you know, you're a drain on resources. Your presence is potentially troublesome, never mind everything that your appearance is laden with, or your identity is laden with. But yeah, knowing that kind of it makes you very conscious of the position you occupy as someone in these spaces, whether you're researching or visiting or what have you. And I think alters that a little bit in quite significant ways for how we understand the prison environment and how it's experienced, which is, after all, what we're very much in the business of trying to do.
You're also highlighting something really important there, Kate, in relation to sort of risk assessment and treatment as well, because so often when women are within the environment, I mean, I found it fascinating to see how psychologists in particular and educational staff would gravitate toward, who have no requirement to wear black and white, but would gravitate towards wearing black trousers and white shirts, which I just thought was absolutely fascinating. And I personally made a conscious choice to wear skirts and dresses, quite colourful clothing, because that's what I wear ordinarily, makeup, perfume, not heavy stuff, just my ordinary daily appearance, because I felt it was really important that women were visible within the environment. And if you've got, especially men who have been treated for sexual offences against women, for instance, it felt really important that they weren't being treated within a sterile environment where there were no signs of femininity, because actually that's, you know, how they interact with women is really important in terms of having a sense of their risk for future. You know, we'd get women with prisoners, with mustn't be left alone with a woman, you know, where in other parts of the prison system. But for us, that felt a massive no-no in terms of treatment, because how are you supposed to treat somebody's risk if they're basically being treated in a sterile environment to go back outside into the world where women form, you know, 52% of the population? But we're increasingly being told we should get out into daylight and nature for our well-being. We should eat healthy food. We should move more. What's it like to be in prison and know that many of the things you should be doing to prolong your life are impossible?
Oh,
It looks like that was with you, Jason.
Yeah, great, yeah. Well, I think there's a number of things here. I think we have to distinguish between the normal regime, when a regime is running normally, and the kind of uniqueness that's existed a little bit since benchmarking in sort of 2013, 2014, which then resulted in lots of prisons running emergency regimes, and then into COVID, where you had a very particular emergency regime that kind of really disrupted everything for a very long time. So I think if we're going to talk in normal, as much as, you know, a prison regime can be thought of as normal, I think one of the
Can you
things
just clarify for listeners who've never been into a prison what emergency regime would look like?
So an emergency regime is essentially when they don't have enough staff to operate the normal unlock regime. So, you know, they won't have enough staff to run the workspaces, gym, education, and all the other kind of activities that take place in a prison or should take place in a prison. When you're on an emergency regime, what that does is that becomes restricted so that you can offer some parts of the regime to some elements of the prison on a rotating basis. But what that means is that for a lot of prisoners, they will be banged up for much longer in the 24-hour period than they would ordinarily be. So if you think about a normal prison regime, you would probably be unlocked at about 8 o'clock in the morning. There would probably, you know, some sort of movement to work, education or activity. Then you would be banged up again, or you'd be brought back to the wing at 11:30. You'd be banged up around 12 o'clock, unlocked around 1, banged up again against 3:30. Maybe if you got an evening unlock, you would be unlocked from, say, 6 till 7:30 or something like that. And then you'd be banged up overnight. You know, that's a kind of rough regime. But if you're on an emergency regime, what you actually may do is get like an hour in the day or a couple of hours in the day where you are allowed out for certain activities, but you'll be banged up for the rest of the 21, 22 hours. But what that means is that in terms of the, you know, what you're saying about, you know, eating well or doing exercise, you know, all of a sudden everything becomes constrained in that way. So, you know, prisons are particularly unhealthy environments anyway, you know, and one of the things that we see, you know, even before pre-pandemic, you know, if you've got someone with flu in a prison, that's it. The whole prison can go down with flu very, very rapidly. You know, and I've seen prisons be absolutely devastated by like, what's the winter vomiting, noroviruses, for instance. I've seen prisons get absolutely devastated by one of those bugs going around because everyone gets it. You know, so, you know, prisons are inherently unhealthy places and, you know, can have huge impacts on your life expectancy. You know, because the medical care that that is available is supposed to be akin to what you get in the community, and probably now is, but that says more about healthcare in the community now than in prisons. But you know, all of these things become problems. But of course, at the moment that you become trapped within a cell and you can't move out of that cell, and you know, you're having to eat in the cell, but you're having to eat food. You know, if we think about the food budgets for prisons, it's what, £1.25 for 3 meals per prisoner a day. That's not per meal, that's per day, per prisoner. You know, so increasingly what we have is prisoners getting 1 hot meal a day. And what they'll do is they'll have a breakfast pack, and they'll have a, say, sandwich or a baguette for lunch. You know, and if we think about this, you know, the diet that we are imposing on prisons in order to save money and to make the prison a cheaper place to run actually limits not just our culinary experiences in prison, but our physical and health related experiences as it relates to food as well. So actually, you know, and there's a reason that lots of prisoners buy hot sauce all the time and condiments just to douse their food. You know, is in order to create something that is akin to their normal cultural or social experiences of food outside of the wall, because prison food is bland at best, unnecessarily so. If you're cooking for 700 people, 1,000 people, you know, it can only ever be bland, and it is minimally healthy. And that's the point, is that it is minimally healthy. You know, what they do is they take the portion size, the amount of vitamins, minerals, etc. that you need for daily survival, and that is what they're working to, is that kind of minimum basis. You know, and that, so there are a wide range of sensory elements to that, including consequences and the sensory consequences of such a poor diet. You know, Kate, do you want to comment on this?
You've invited me to come in right at the most sensorially evocative moment, for which I thank you, dear. To be, I mean, I did have the odd person sort of not quite interpret accurately what I was in the environment to understand, and ask me what to do or how to alleviate the discomfort they were suffering as a result of perpetual flatulence of a cellmate that they couldn't escape from, or snoring. These things are not actually trivial when you're locked up with someone for potentially 23 hours a day, actually. Snoring, it really is no joke. And there have been instances where people have been violently attacked because they're keeping someone from sleep. And given the amount of disruption and disturbance to sleep that occurs for a multitude of reasons, not just noise, of course, but noise is one of them, to talk about noise again, which wasn't my intention when I started. Yeah, considering the extent to which that happens, I mean, if somebody is distressed and is screaming and crying through the night, banging perpetually, no one's getting sleep, sometimes for days, weeks at a time. People talk about how violent these places are, but actually in many ways, what's profoundly surprising to me is how much accommodation is made for some people, in recognition that their behaviour is symptomatic of profound distress or a health condition that they can't help, and how those distinctions are made is quite telling. And interesting on many levels, in terms of what the consequences are for that lack of healthiness. I mean, there's no, it's no coincidence that gym features so heavily, that taking care of yourself becomes itself a performative means of expressing resistance in some way to the institution, but also the kind of ingenuity it necessitates for those who are able to. So, of course, cooking in kettles is something that is quite routine in prisons. If you have the means to buy things on canteen, buy things at an inflated rate, of course, that means that you can't spend on other things perpetually. So these are constant antagonisms and tensions that have to be navigated, and can be a source of discontent, upset, or argument unnecessarily. But also the way, I think it's an interesting site on which to explore the ways in which unthinking managerial decisions can be made that have sometimes a profound impact on people's perceptions of their quality of life and what they can do. So, for example, the smoking ban is one example of that. I mean, if you don't have a lot and then you take away tobacco, which of course was the basis for the prison economy, things happen that aren't spoken of or haven't been spoken of widely enough. But I was in one particular prison. I was working as a research assistant, and because I wasn't there very long, I didn't have keys. I was being escorted around by a very accommodating gentleman, but it just so happened that we went onto the wing, or our going onto the wing coincided with a senior management decision that had been arbitrarily made without consulting with everybody to remove any item that could be cooked from the canteen list. And the men were up in arms because all of a sudden their ability to maintain a healthy diet by independent means has been completely removed from them overnight, no warning, no nothing. And we happened to go on the wing and start talking to people as unrest was fermenting in quite a serious way that his presence allowed him to intercept. And he didn't spend a lot of time on the wing because he'd been very seriously assaulted a while before. So it was quite interesting watching him revisit what he liked about that job. But you know, these aspects of life and living and humanity, so easily overlooked or trivialized relative to things that we immediately consider more pressing, like violence and so forth, can nevertheless be experienced as a violence. We know that people in prison have a far lower life expectancy for a number of reasons, but you know, the idea that feeding people the very basic amount to keep them alive is some sensible economic decision versus what it's doing for their health, both mental and physical, for their behavior, their ability to regulate their mood, particularly again if they're neurodivergent or they have mental health issues, particularly diabetes, you know, all manner of things that coexist together, you know, that we don't pay sufficient attention to, most of which amongst most people are revisited upon us when these people come back into our community, and we have to think carefully in a considerably more joined up way about that, I think, and what depriving people even of the very basic commensality or facility for commensality that breaking bread together represents over many years.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's interesting, going back to smell for a minute, if you walk onto a wing where people are cooking in their kettles or using other ingenious mechanisms for illicit cooking, you know, and what they're doing is either sharing food with cellmates, with friends, with others. Actually, when you walk onto a wing, that has a kind of olfactory kind of marker. And actually, you can smell when that is happening. But also accompanying that smell, you can see people physically sharing and, you know, and the passing of goods to one another, not in furtive kind of backstage economy ways, but in terms of, oh, I made you a thing, or, you know, if someone's made birthday cakes out of digestive biscuits, you know, and they're giving people cakes. Actually, what you do is, you know, that, as Kate said, that commensality, that normal process of making food and sharing that with someone or giving that to someone actually is part of our normal human sociality that is otherwise deprived. You walk onto a prison wing where that is happening, not only can you smell, I mean, obviously it's not often a pleasant smell, but you can smell where that is happening. If you walk onto a wing and that smell is absent, actually the relationships on that wing are far more atomized. And actually you can begin to see, or you can begin to detect that atomization of relationships is actually ramping up tensions as well. You know, and it's, you know, there's obviously an obverse for that. So like there was a good period of time between sort of 2013 to 2016, 2017, where, you know, synthetic cannabinoids or synthetic opiates were hit the prison system significantly. And you walk onto a wing and if you could smell that blatantly,
fish food, fish food. And the officers would comment on it, and if you'd walk on and you could smell like weed on the air, what was being said to you in one way or another was, oh, thank God we're only dealing with people having a bit of weed rather than potentially having, you know, collapsing routinely. I mean, watching that unfold on the prison wing and the effects it was having, particularly, and it was the perfect storm of withdrawing tobacco and the extent to which the city was being overrun at the time with mamba and spice. but people weren't being able to dilute their intake with tobacco as they would have done. And there is a sensory component, obviously, in terms of the smell, but also in terms of the rhythms of movement, those jerky movements that people have when they're on Mamba and Spice, but also that how anxiety inducing it is when people just drop in front of you. And when that becomes something that is part of your everyday, and one prison officer recounted doing unlock one morning and seeing someone just drop before him, and he assumed initially that it was an epileptic fit or a fit of some other kind, and saying to me, I took my eye off him for a second, and I turned around and he dropped, and I just went to him and I just held him up. I didn't know what else to do. And it was terrifying. So, there are always those sensory components to that, but also the extent to which that they are necessary to read a really complex range of shifts in culture, behaviour, safety, well-being. And when we think about the extent to which some of that is taken for granted but not explicitly spoken of, but how absolutely integral it is to managing actual risk and safety and reading what's going on when things change, which in the case of where I was and where I was witnessing that was really, really rapid. And terrifying, and you don't forget the first time you see a Mamba attack. Nobody forgets the first time they've seen that, right?
Thank you very much. You've given us a brilliant description, really, of your work regarding the sensory impact of prison. I'm aware that we've taken up a lot of your time this afternoon. But I would be interested in your view on whether you think the creation of the kind of environment you've been talking about is deliberately a part of the punishment. And I suppose that could be either consciously or unconsciously. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. As we said, one of the kind of recurring themes is that the idea of punishment and the idea of the power of the state are absolutely encoded into the senses, and the sensory emissions within the criminal justice system is absolutely, from the point that we put handcuffs on people, and if you think about, if you put someone in handcuffs against their will, you are sending a very, very specific message about that person's status and what you are doing to them. And in terms of the state doing that to you, it is absolutely communicating to you the moment those handcuffs go on that your relationship as a citizen has fundamentally changed. And the moment that you subject a prisoner to the clangs, bangs, crashes and jingles of the prison environment, or the manner in which you enclose them into a cell where that air isn't moving, if you put them into a place where they have absolutely no nose lids or ear lids, that they can't shut out the environment of the prison, and every time they are subject to a sensory experience that they themselves cannot curate because it is being imposed upon them, is absolutely a communication of the punishment that they are experiencing in terms of the prison. And that is deliberate. But also, I think, one of the processes of imprisonment is, a kind of a process of pacification. It is about, making and rendering the prisoner body docile. And actually the repeated, and I think this is where it becomes thoughtless, is that the repeated sensory bombardment of the imprisonment, in some ways it is, if you take the prison environment, in some ways it is a stilted sensory environment, because it doesn't have the panoply of senses of smells, sounds, tastes that you would have on the outside. But what it is the range of sensory experiences that you are subject to them constantly and without an ability to mitigate. And that plays a distinct role in that pacification and the production of the docile body, because it is a repeated communication of your powerlessness. It is a repeated communication of your punishment and your status as a prisoner. And that is continual. So actually the sensory bombardment that the individual goes through on a daily basis is absolutely a part of that, of the punishment, and what that punishment is designed to do in terms of turning you into a docile citizen. You know, absolutely, I think it's fundamentally encoded into every element of the prison in that regard.
Absolutely, but I also think there is something in that is on occasion a little bit more explicitly managed in terms of the imposition of particular relationships and forms of relationships between prisoners and those who are charged with their care and containment. And I think if we are to think about the impact of these environments, not only does it behove us to think more broadly about how that those experiences also impact on the well-being of staff, but I think it would be remiss not to think about that more broadly, because these are also members of our community, and they are also members of the prison community, and will report to you various impacts of being exposed to those spaces. They also have a higher number of, well, less so nowadays, but certainly did back in the day, have a higher number of veterans in their number, for example, just like prisoners do. Being exposed to that noise relentlessly, feeling obliged to shout. It's really common for prison officers to complain about throat problems or perpetual laryngitis or losing their hearing. And you sort of want to say, has it occurred to you maybe to shout less? But of course, in those spaces, you kind of have very little option, and the men don't either, which of course imposes particular forms of behaviour which are then interpreted negatively, particularly, for example, if you're having an interaction with your probation officer and you're shouting at them, and that appears to be incredibly aggressive, and maybe you've got a problem with women, and blah, blah. Actually, you're just institutionalized. And when you spend a lot of time in institutions like that, the only way you can make yourself heard, I mean, if you have a female voice, it's different because you're at a different register. So actually not being heard becomes a little bit harder. Not that there's anything I want to say in prison that I would be particularly bothered about people hearing, unless of course it relates to someone's personal. People are often divulging very personal trauma. But I think we need to think about the conditions in which we are asking people to work, as well as live. And I also think thinking about it in that holistic way in terms of the conditions that we're imposing on the round is perhaps a far easier, regrettably, an easier way of encouraging people to think about the importance of it, because we have a huge number of people working within our prison system who are also being subject to really stark, uncomfortable environments in which, you know, toilet roll is seemingly something that is a luxury too much to ask for on occasion. There's no comfort, there's no respite from the noise. It has, and that harshness and discomfort necessarily has an impact not only on how they're experiencing the space, but how they're experiencing the people they work with. And this is not an easy solution, or but a range of them that invites us to really seriously think about what it is we want our prisons to do, what it is that they are doing, and what we think they are for. And I think that some of the greatest potential of the sensory is to collapse the distance in terms of imagination and thinking and feeling between those who have directly experienced those spaces and those who have not. And that's partly partly why I feel the need to speak about it endlessly, because I can't, they're so particular environments. When you speak to some staff, like, you know, I'm the number one saying to me and the number two of Midtown, I don't bother to try and explain this to my friends and my family. There's just no way to explain it. They don't get it, and they don't get why I'm here.
Brilliant answer. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful note to, you know, conscious of the time, and we need to be sort of drawing the interview to a close. But just finally, you know, how do each of you cope with that sensory impact of prison when carrying out your research? You can hear it's very, you know, you can hear the visceral effect for you both.
Do you want to go first, Kate? Or?
Yeah, I will, and the reason I'll go first, hopefully, I think will become clear. The impact and effect are very, very different for a number of reasons on us, respectively. Jay and I are a couple, which is not known to everyone. Bizarrely, sometimes people we work with haven't cottoned on to the fact, but I mean, we've been together for 18 years, Jay and I. And there was a point at which he was working in the third sector, and he was going back into prisons a lot. And the change in his behaviour, his demeanour, was so marked when he was coming home. It was a revisitation of his former self. It was a very obvious increase in adrenaline and wariness and being on edge and not smiling and adopting a defensive, aggressive posture, and that's very difficult to witness as a partner and experience as a partner, but it also is obviously very particular to his experiences relative to mine, and I think powerful testimony to the lasting impact of what exposure to these places can do to you. For me personally, that no doubt colours my interaction with this space and my particular consciousness of what it can do on a very personal level. But the emotional toll of being around people who are distressed, who are self-harming, who maybe haven't had an unguarded conversation with another human being for a very long time, where everything they've said hasn't been written down and recorded and documented and assessed. Hearing cries of anguish, or seeing people, having people self-harm in front of you and not being able to either prevent that from happening, because that would be inappropriate, but also being unable to intervene in any way that you would in other circumstances, even if it was only to get them to a tap or find some antiseptic, or and the way in which that prompts you to think about the limits of your own ethical approach when confronted with the need to conform to the ethical operations of an institution, and what that does for how you understand your role and what you're doing, and your complicity in it, were the hardest things for me. But I was very lucky in that I had someone I could talk about the emotional impact of it with, who understood in a way that no one else would understand. But that was also really incredibly unfair of me. But I found I couldn't speak to my supervisors about it, because they didn't understand the environment in the same way. One of them had been a probation officer briefly at a prison, but when I said to her, I'm talking to a lot of self-harmers at the moment, and that's quite difficult and confronting, her response to me was, it doesn't sound to me like you're conforming to security protocols, and you do realise that a lot of people in prison have Hep C and HIV. And I said to her, I'm not rolling around in bodily fluids, and I have been trained in security at several different establishments, and that really isn't the point. And if you can't understand what I'm trying to say, I won't ever try and say it to you again, and I never did. Jay.
I think for me, I mean, yeah, I mean, doing that, because when I was working in the third sector, a lot of my work was very immersive. So we were doing kind of quasi-ethnographic work in the prison quite a lot. And yeah, I think, you know, the impact on that on me was, you know, when I said that I'd gone back in prison and the hearing of the clanging and of the gate had switched me like that, this was that same process, but over a much extended period of time. You know, and Kate had obviously said to me, like, I don't like what this is doing to you. And a friend of mine who was leaving the UK to go and work in the US, I saw her off that day, and she was like, you know, she actually said to me outright, she's very German, but she said to me outright, I don't like who you are now. And in fact, if you don't change, I'm not sure I want to know you again. You know, and there was that kind of quite profound kind of moment of me going, ugh. But in terms of the sensory, I think there's a different point that I want to make. And I think going back into prisons only sporadically since starting thinking about the sensory and the manner in which we kind of conceptualize these ideas, I think as a researcher, one of the things that it's done for me is sensitize me to the fact that how much of our time we spend filtering out the sensory kind of onslaught that that you're subject to when you're in these particular spaces, and how exhausting, how mentally exhausting it is to be filtering that out when you're not even aware that that's what you're doing. And I think that is part of what ramps up the anxiety, what ramps up the stress, what ramps up the emotionality or the emotiveness of these spaces, is that actually what you're having to do is quite a lot of mental work just to make the place manageable. And you're not aware that you're doing that. But being sensitized to the sensory has absolutely made me aware of that, and just how exhausting being in prison, even as a visitor, is. And of course, that makes me much more sensitive to how exhausting it is for either staff or prisoners who are there every day, all the time, and cannot escape it.
Thank you both so much for your honesty there, and I think, you know, it seems very fitting that you're both exploring the senses, because actually there is something about managing to stay connected to your own sensitivity, whether that's emotions or the other, you know, external, the senses that are filtering the external world. Because I think so often what happens in the criminal justice system, people do switch off, you know, they use all that mental energy to switch off from their senses, whether it be interoception internally or, you know, tuning out some of that other stuff. So really appreciate you both for having stayed with that and staying connected to that, but also being honest enough to share that today. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. And good to see your face again, Kate. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.